Hey everybody, happy Friday. Welcome to our weekly, bi-weekly, I don't know, I haven't been as super regular because travel is back, at least for some of us. So I'm happy to catch our regular Privacy Chat viewers. It's been great as I've been traveling a little bit now around the world, Tel Aviv, Brussels, elsewhere, to run into people who are like, I watch those LinkedIn Lives, keep it up. I was actually in the rainforest in outside San Juan, El Yunque, and I had one of the Future Privacy Forum, backpacks, one of the old ones, sort of, with me, and a guy walks up to me and says, "Future Privacy Forum, are you connected to that guy who does those LinkedIn Lives?" My family was like blown away. The reality is, El Yunque during Christmas is like being in Times Square. I mean, every tourist was in town, so it wasn't like it was in the remote, Amazon jungle, but it was still. So anyway, thanks to everyone who's out there from around the world. I'm delighted that today I have two amazing people with me who, if you follow privacy, data protection, tech policy, you should know. If you do not, shame on you. But here we are. I'm introducing you to them because they are two people doing incredibly interesting work. Professor Heng Xu is a senior leader in the world of privacy and data protection with hundreds of published papers. She comes from more the technical and computer science side of the world to privacy. Us lawyers feel like we own this and we write about it and we have all the answers. And the reality is it's disciplines like ethics and philosophy and computer science and sociology and psychology that really have key insights that we all need to be listening and hearing better. So welcome, Heng. Heng is currently at the American University Kogod School of Business, where she runs a center that is leading really interesting work around cybersecurity and privacy. Welcome, Heng.
Thank you.
And Tiffany Li is a law professor at the University of New Hampshire, previously at BU, at Yale ISP, and she's, I won't say junior because she's not junior, but more earlier career law professor and researcher who has been quite prolific and been publishing really relevant scholarship. It is not to be assumed that academics do relevant work. It's not their job. Their job is to advance science, advance their fields. Sometimes that's highly relevant. Sometimes it's important and foundational. But Tiffany's been doing work around the post-pandemic privacy landscape, work around privacy and civil rights. And I'm going to ask her. And then another paper that is in progress that maybe she can talk about as well around algorithms. But let me start quickly with Heng because she's got a paper that's been one of my favorites around a pretty complicated challenge that comes along with the identification and differential privacy. So Heng, can you talk a little bit about that paper in particular and what some of the key takeaways were?
Sure. Thank you for having me here, Jules. And actually, that paper, I would like to acknowledge your contribution, or in general, FPF events contribution. We got that idea from talking to some audience at one of the FPF events. They started sharing back then, that was 19, right before pandemic, talking about their pressure about doing GDPR compliance. Back then, they talk about data anonymization, because the GDPR says that the principles of data protection should therefore not apply to anonymous information. So this actually incentivizes more and more business, right, to anonymize their data. But there are so many anonymization techniques on the market. Which one they shall choose? And what are the fundamental differences, right, in terms of these different algorithms that be used to apply to anonymize your data? So in this paper, we actually did a kind of sort of taxonomy more for the application point of view. We pass out that broadly speaking, there are two categories, two different types of data anonymization technique. One is to remove sensible attributes. And then the other is to insert noise right? Mathematical carefully calculated noise to your data so that you can't link the original data sets with the human's identity. So basically these two. And in terms of data removal, key anonymity is one of the most popular example in that category that used as the data anonymization technique and fundamentally about remove the sensible attributes. And then differential privacy, which is the state of the art, right? We talk a lot nowadays. It's basically belonging to the categories of noise insertion. So in that paper, we analyzed how these different types of data anonymization could actually change the underlying statistic distribution of your data after you're applying these techniques, right? So after you're anonymizing your data, what kind of things you need to pay attention from data science, data analytics the view, and how you are going to analyze this data after these treatment, either in terms of data removal or noise insertion that, for the reason of data anonymization. So we're also looking into the literature from sociology, from law, also from the employment setting, and to talk about what we mean by statistic disparity. And we also categorize that fundamentally looking across all different fields, there are two different types of disparity detection or disparity, in terms of statistical disparity. One is through separation, the other is the variation, right? When you look at different, subsamples of your data. So when your job is going to deal with disparity detection, the data scientists really need to understand how data has been treated with the different types of data anonymization techniques. So basically our takeaway message in our paper is a 2x2, 4 different kind of metrics, how the 2 different types of, types of data anonymization technique may interact with the disparity detection techniques when what you need to know, and all the detailed guidance were in the paper. So that's probably the takeaway message.
So to make it super simple for the really legal lawyers who struggle with some of the nuts and bolts of de-identification, it makes sense, of course, that when you have small, unique subsets of data that might, however, show that it is only the kids who were from low incomes or the kids who are of one ethnic group were the ones who didn't pass the test or lost out because of remote learning or were subject to a particular health disparity. It's correct that the identification techniques mask that because small data sets are what can lead to re-identification. If there's only one kid of a particular type of metric, and it's going to be possible to attribute that. But that's a huge problem, obviously, for most of what we care about today, because we're going to lose racial disparities, discriminatory impacts, and a whole range of others. But it sounds like you're not done with pointing out that there's a problem. You're looking to sort of help address the problem by having researchers well understand when they might be creating these disparities so that they can go further. It seems like you're building on, you did more, you pointed out a problem, but you're taking some next steps to solve it or address it. Can you say a little bit more about that?
So one of the subtle message we try to share is that, of course, when you are dealing with important, societally important questions such as health disparity, if you want to detect health disparity, the best situation is to work on the original data set. But for certain cases, right, your data, you can't get original data sets. The data has been processed with data anonymization technique. Then you have to figure out what type of techniques you used. So is it kind of removed sensible attributes or inserted noise, right? So you have to know that. And then follow our paper. We have a manual, we have a kind of, if you use the data removal, and if the disparity you want to detect is to detect the statistical variance through across different samples, then it's okay. Or if it is noise insertion technique, and then your disparity pattern you want to detect is through separation techniques, then you should do X and Y, Z. So it's basically say, if you know this data has been processed, then you have to know the underlying techniques. If you don't know the exact technique, but at least tell us that whether it's a noise insertion like differential privacy, or it has been processed by key and limited technique, which is a data removal technique. And then based on the disparity detection task, you have to treat your statistical analysis with caution. And sometimes the disparity detection could be a false alarms just simply because how data anonymization tweeted and manipulated or changed the underlying statistical pattern in your original data set. So that's our message.
Professor Li, your forthcoming paper on privacy and civil rights is in my weekend reading stack. I think people who are close watchers of the broad debate understand that the debate in the US is largely actually about fairness, equity, discrimination, and civil rights. And indeed, that's likely to be what determines whether we get a privacy bill. Privacy activists don't vote, sorry to say. We create headlines, but there is no movement of people going to the polls saying we're the privacy voters. The civil rights community is a politically engaged force, and you hear it in the words of the Biden administration. You hear them talking about fairness, equity. You hear it in the FTC. There's some debate whether the FTC is the best suited place to become a civil rights agency. Obviously, the chair and others think, well, this is what privacy is about, so they should. Some of the other commissioners on the commission don't think that the FTC can. Give us some sense as to where you're going with your paper and what you've sketched out.
I think it's an exciting time for privacy and civil rights. So the newly confirmed Commissioner Alvaro Bedoya wrote an article or gave a speech on privacy as a civil right a few years ago. And that's what inspired me to write my piece. I think it was a great concept. And then I just kept thinking, what does that mean? Like, what does it look like if we situate privacy as a civil right? How does that change from privacy as just, a constitutional right or a tort right? What are the civil rights dimensions of it? So thinking about fairness, thinking about discrimination, all of those issues. And it's something that I think is extremely relevant and getting more relevant by the day. With everything that comes up in the news, we constantly have these civil rights and privacy issues come up. So I'm doing work on that, and I'm trying to think through some of the same questions that we get into in terms of algorithmic fairness as well, and algorithmic discrimination and decisions about that. So I think, Dr. Xu's work is really important there. A lot of this work is really practical for people on the ground. I've heard so many people who work in these companies dealing with AI who are just concerned about, how do they comply with GDPR? And most people don't want to be bad actors, right? They don't want to be on the wrong side of civil rights. But what do they do about that? So things like figuring out how to safely use data, that's going to be crucial, not just for business, but for civil rights purposes as well. I'm thinking through even things like, well, how should we anonymize data if we anonymize it? Is there some way we can still use sensitive data, or should we just not collect it at all, right? I think these are really big questions. So I'm looking into them as well in my research, but obviously from the much more legal, less technical side of things.
Yeah, you touch on an issue that I think we hear about from researchers and we hear about it from companies. We are not collecting in many cases sensitive data because of the higher consent standard. Many of the states have recently passed such laws, or there might be opt-out obligations. We're also supposed to be ensuring that we're not optimizing in a way that includes or excludes one class of individual. What do we do? And, although there are more nuanced views about this at the FTC, frankly, Rebecca Kelly Slaughter in one of the credit-related opinions said, you should actually collect some of this data so you can, assess. We don't see it really reflected well on the legislative side, where we're still dealing with sort of blunter, if it's sensitive, it has a higher standard, maybe exclusions for research, but even then, only research in the public good, not pure research, this and that, and certainly not in terms of optimizing your product, right? Nobody seems to think that that's a noble cause. But if your product is gonna, determine who sees a certain content or who sees an ad or, who gets different pricing, clearly we need some ways to get that data. So definitely eager to see where you go with that. Can you tell us something about your in progress paper called Algorithmic Shadow Harms? What is that about? Where do you go with that?
Great. So it's actually been renamed. The title, I think you had an earlier version of this. So the title of the paper is now just Algorithmic Destruction. And it's about this concept that Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter and others, the FTC, have mentioned, as well as other people just generally. It's this idea that if you use data that you got improperly or you process improperly, and then you train a machine learning model or you create an algorithm based on that data, you should then be forced to delete whatever algorithm you developed. So as a remedy for, say, a privacy wrong, right? For a privacy violation, a company might be asked to delete any algorithms they use that they were trained based on that improperly gotten data. So it's a little bit radical to think about, but it's something that might give you some rights that we don't currently have protected right now. So my paper looks at that. And I discuss what I call the algorithmic shadow, which is this idea that, if one of your data points is used as part of the training data, so my face photo as part of a facial recognition training database, after this facial recognition algorithm has been trained on that data, this company, say a company called Clearview AI, might be forced to delete the initial data from the data set. But whatever algorithm they've already developed has already used my face, my data point, and might be somehow predisposed to, be influenced somehow by the presence of my face photo. There's some shadow in the algorithm that doesn't get deleted. And I think that creates some sort of existential psychological harms, right? Like I don't want my face to be part of a facial recognition algorithm that causes harms against political dissidents or something, right? But right now we don't have much to allow people like me or anyone in the audience to try to advocate for that right. And that's something I think we should at least talk about a little bit more.
I raised the issue of algorithmic destruction to somebody senior at the FTC because I said this is new, it's novel, but how does that really work? How can you extract knowledge, which is in theory what an algorithm is, from a company's brain or code? And they pointed out that the recent cases were a couple of folks where, hey, they weren't even going to be in that business anymore. They just deleted whatever was going on there, and it wasn't going to undo anything. But they said, let's see how you would make Google or Facebook or some code-based company stop knowing something that it learned improperly, right? I mean, if an algorithm says when there is a high number of people approaching our IP addresses from this country, treat that as high risk, you could delete the data that taught you that, but you would still know that. Do you never use it again? I don't know. So, I mean, Heng, as a technologist who can code and writes algorithms and reads algorithms, is it possible to delete an algorithm and then, based on data that was improperly collected, and then sort of go forward and not have that knowledge recreated somehow or reknown? Or I don't know, maybe there's some places where this is doable and others where it might be more complicated.
Well, you raise an excellent question. I think the algorithm itself, right? It's beyond the model. It contains the data. So even if you delete the data, or you say, I just delete the data, and all the thing you learned is gone. No, the algorithms remember the patterns of the data they extract, right? So the machine learning algorithm remember everything about the data they learned.
Algorithm. I mean, that's what the FTC seems to be requiring. Just erase the algorithm. Does that? Or the algorithm is more complicated, right? It's got a lot of things in it. Can you erase the part of the algorithm that was informed by the ill-gotten data?
Well, the algorithm can it's constitutional of different patterns, right? What do you mean by deletion of algorithm, the knowledge you abstracted? And what do you mean? Can I just change several parameters? You say this is another new algorithms? And if you are satisfied with that, I could do some tricks and change a few parameters and tuning it, by kind of seemingly it looks different. I give you the older version and say, well, I satisfy this deletion, but then I move on with the new version that treated with several parameters. So how we're going to say what's defined within the algorithm, how we can define that. So that's my kind of a struggle in terms of this conversation from the legal point of view, right? Algorithm, what constitutes that? It's data, it's the pattern they learned, they remember. And it's also consider the parameters they can tune to apply to the future data. So which part you want me to delete? Or which part can really be permanently deleted? That's the
Professor Li, I
question.
assume you're digging down with technologists on this.
So there is a future looking part, right? There is once your pattern you learned, you can transform learning, right? You can apply to a new data sets without the old data sets. So you want me to delete the old data sets with the old so-called pattern and machine learning algorithm I learned based on the old data set, or how we're going to do that? So that's a debate, right? That's a debate here.
Yeah, Professor Li, where have you gone with this so far in the paper? I assume you're grappling with some of these issues.
Right. So it's a really interesting concept. I think legally first to just talk about it as whether or not it's a remedy in law, right? Would that actually remedy the violation? Would it bring the victim, would it make the victim whole? Would it prevent unjust enrichment or what have you? And then in computer science, I think there are some interesting people working on machine unlearning. And there are some practical ways, I know it's a little silly. There's some practical ways people have talked about doing things, even as basic as things like time stamping, when you've changed the parameters, like you mentioned, when you've included new data sets, and then literally rolling it back to whatever time the FTC or a regulator asks you to roll it back to, and then trying to retrain whatever algorithm you have based on the new data. So it's a very vague understanding. And I love that Dr. Xu brought up the problem with deletion, because I've also been wrestling with this for a while, for years now. We keep talking about the rights to deletion in privacy law, and that's not really clear from a computer science standpoint what we're even talking about. Like, what does it mean to delete data to the point that it complies with, say, the GDPR? What does it mean? Do we have to delete the data from this specific set of data that we're using for this purpose? Do we have to overwrite the data? Do we have to make sure that there's no imprint of the data anywhere in the company? Can we store it in sort of long-term storage, but just not use it? It's not super clear. And I think that's something that's going to come up in algorithmic deletion as well, because we haven't even solved it for data deletion.
Heng, you are often collaborating with Professor Nan Zhang, a brilliant computer scientist. Your most recent paper with Nan is From Contextualizing to Context Theorizing, Assessing Context Effects in Privacy Research. Tell me something about that.
Sure. The title sounds very academic driven, but the story is very straightforward. What we try to do is to introduce some statistic machine learning tools to understand or to solve a very decade-old problem, is how we can capture people's attitudes about privacy. This is a very old question. We're still debating, right? Because we have the privacy paradox phenomenon where when you try to ask people's privacy attitudes, right? They say, well, yes, of course I value my privacy, but if you give them $5, coupon, they will immediately fill in their mailing address, email address, and phone number. And also in survey research, right, or any types of behavior methods in terms of direct approaching consumers and to ask, right, to ask their privacy attitudes, there is a phenomenon called now you mention effect. Maybe they never realized that they have certain privacy preferences, but now when a researcher approach a subject and ask, to what extent you worry about the information you share on Facebook. And because you mentioned Facebook, they immediately think about Cambridge Analytica, they think about misinformation, disinformation, right? Then they correlate with all the news titles. And then they think, yes, I worry that Facebook may misuse my personal information, although they may never think about that question in their daily use of Twitter and Facebook. So we were trying to answer the question about, is survey itself enough to really capture the consumer's privacy attitudes, right? Because there are biases. There are social desirability biases where everyone wants to say they value something, society values, right? Or their peers values. So they will say, yes, I value privacy so much without even thinking about what privacy is in their mental model. So our question is, a lot of legislations and regulation that cites national representative surveys saying that American citizens are increasingly value about privacy. That's why we need more and more privacy legislations. But then we also heard some, researchers criticizing, saying that the attitudes we collect through surveys and behavior experiments are inflated, right? Because we artificially engineer a context and make them to record their experience or enlarge the importance of context of privacy in their mindset at the moment of collecting this data. So what we did is to introduce a technique in the statistical machine learning field called mixture decomposition. And we see all the data that collected through surveys, through asking, through behavior experiments as a mixture of their true attitudes embedded with the research context, right? How that introduce or shape or inflate or reduce their privacy attitudes. So you can see there's a two different mixture of statistic, distribution of the data being embedded with anything you collected, you ask from your subjects. So what we did is that we developed a tool for all the behavior researchers, right? When they collect their data, they send their data as the input to our tool and algorithm, and our algorithm will intelligently pass out, which part or the true distribution of their organic attitudes, and then also separate the context effects, right? In terms of the instrument or how you design an experiment, make them to think or relate or inflate or reduce any of their mental model about what privacy entails. So that's what we did. It's basically say, is privacy attitude we collected through surveys are really inflated or not? We will show you through our mixture decomposition technique.
Wow, phenomenally interesting. Sometimes people refer to the gap between the practice of what people actually do as well as the surveys as the privacy paradox. And more recently, we've had some scholars say, well, no, there really is no paradox. It's what people do is often based on a lot of, burden or a lot of, fooling them about what actually is happening. If they understood what was happening, there'd be no paradox. They would actually act more in line with the surveys, but because of dark patterns or other, or other challenges, they act differently. But it's not really that they intend to act differently. In the minute or two I have left, I want to get maybe just a little flavor. Tiffany, your paper, Post-Pandemic Privacy Law, was one of the privacy papers for policymakers winners that emerged from the FPF jury, and we were delighted to discuss it. But for those who did not capture that event, what was your takeaway? How has privacy law been impacted by the pandemic of tracking and COVID and so forth?
So my 30-second takeaway, I think we suffered a huge privacy collapse over the pandemic. You can call it a privacy pandemic of sorts as well. I think we've seen this because of the huge increase in data collection and usage for medical purposes, for very real and necessary public health purposes. but that's created normalization of privacy violations. And then we've seen every sector of society move online. And even now, for example, some of us are still online, right? We're doing these kinds of talks online, we're doing conferences online still. There's still a lot of sort of telehealth and other issues going online. And that's created a shift in our privacy norms and expectations. And as the lawyers in the audience know, a lot of our laws rest on those privacy expectations. So this collapse of privacy norms or privacy protection expectation, I think is harmful. And I think the law has to address it. Primarily, we have to make sure that our laws do allow for the use of data in emergency settings, but have protections so that we can't just let every single emergency cause another, failure in privacy protection.
You now know why I am a fan of these amazing humans and incredible scholars. We've posted links. Your job now is to read and actually understand in greater depth the snapshots that Heng and Tiffany provided. Let me thank you both. Really great to see you. And to our watchers and readers, you can find the papers on SSRN and elsewhere where you can pretty easily access them over the weekend. Thanks, Heng. Thanks, Tiffany. Great to see you. Have a good weekend, everybody.